That's right, the reason I've been doing a bunch of different My Singing Monsters videos this month is because the My Singing Monsters team asked me to be the very first guest artist to design the new loading screen to be in the game for the full month of their next Month of the Mythical event. And in today's video, I'm going to be breaking down my design process for this piece and giving a bunch of insight into how I draw and design monsters or redesign monsters, and hopefully give lots of other aspiring artists out there who like drawing beasties some good tips and inspiration. Even though now I'm starting to focus a lot more on story-focused episodes with my new mythology series Mythical and my new superhero-inspired series Vigilance, and I'll actually be announcing a new monster-focused series today at the end of the video revolving around the narrator and the world of my My Singing Monsters More Monstrous series. But given the art the My Singing Monsters team hired me to make for them and that it's some of the best art I've ever made, I figured doing a design process episode could be a good change for today. So I'm excited to talk about this stuff, and we're going to start off by going over the composition and what goes into planning out a piece like this. So let's get into it, shall we? Let's go!
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show.
Now, something that some people might not realize is that doing a piece with, say, 3 creatures in it is actually more difficult than doing 3 individual drawings of those same creatures. Because when you're putting multiple characters into one piece, you have to figure out a composition that makes sure to highlight all of those characters and doesn't have them too overlapping each other, but also makes it feel like they're all still a part of the same piece and world. And luckily, I've actually been practicing that more lately, doing some bigger pieces, like in my first few Mythical episodes, and I did a Multiverse Tales episode recently, in which I had 2 characters fighting, so I have been practicing multi-character composition a bit more recently, and that definitely helped with this, but this piece had an extra complicated layer to it, which is that, for one thing, they needed the My Singing Monsters logo at a specific place front and center for the loading screen, and 2, I needed to make sure that none of the creature's important parts would be hidden behind, say, the loading bar that would be popping up on the loading screen and the big blue bubble logo. And then on top of that, there is also the fact that this loading screen needed to work in a bunch of different framings, because the My Singing Monsters game can be played on multiple different devices, and something like an iPad has very different framing from a longer iPhone or something like that. Luckily, they sent me a template that had the My Singing Monsters logo in the place they needed it to be in, and they had different framing options, so I kept those on screen with the loading bar on screen and stuff, and just decreased the opacity so that they could be there and I could use them as reference as I was trying to figure out how to have all of these creatures fit. The creatures that they were having me draw were brand new rare versions of the Anglow, Hyehehe, and Cherubble, all of which were designed by My Singing Monsters superfans Eric, Chris, and Quinn as a part of the Ultimate Creator program that My Singing Monsters has done. And that's one thing that, this is a side tangent thing, but that's something that really resonates with me about the My Singing Monsters team, is that they do a really great job incorporating and communicating with their community, which is something that I've always tried to do on this channel as well with things like my monthly community redraws. Which, by the way, there will be a brand new one announced at the end of this episode. So if you want to try to get your own creatures made more monstrous by me, make sure to listen till the end. But anyway, I was super excited by the designs I was getting to work with. I have actually done a more monstrous Hyehehe before, but that obviously wasn't actually the rare one. But there was one last thing that I needed to factor in when I was coming up with the composition, which was probably, I mean, none of this was really stressful, but if any part was stressful, it was probably the composition part, because that was really the thing that would define how this piece ended up turning out. And the last things to consider were what was going to go over the My Singing Monsters logo. Obviously, I couldn't have so much that it was making us unable to read it, but I did notice that in past loading screen examples, there was almost always something covering the O in My Singing Monsters, and there would sometimes be other creatures, like parts of their bodies would be going in front of the logo, so I wanted to have a little bit of that. And I noticed that the rare Anglow has this ball that kind of sits on its tongue. So I thought, well, that's perfect. I already knew that for this composition, I wanted to have the rare Anglow kind of wrapping some of its tentacles and its arm claw things that stick out of its head coming around and in front of the logo. So having that ball come up and sit right in front of the O was just, I thought that was perfect. And I also made sure that, well, the 2 characters on the sides, the rare Cherubble and the rare Hyehehe, I knew their full bodies weren't going to fit in the smallest framing option, but I knew I had to make sure to at least have their heads in the smallest version, the main focal point of each of the creatures. So after some finessing and moving things around, I finally got a framing that I was really happy with, and then I could move on to start roughing out the details. Now, while this piece is different from the stuff I usually draw for reasons I've talked about and we'll talk more about later, I draw in 4 distinct stages most of the time. One is the basic pose and layout, which we just saw, where I was blocking out just thick, usually bluish kind of color blocks to pose out the characters, then the rough details, which we're going into now, and then I'll go into inking, and then finally shading and lighting. Now, for the rough details stage, I'm not doing a refined image yet or any refined line work. That's what I'll get into when we go to inking, but I am figuring out the main design of the character now and its final proportions. I'll often change some things from whatever I blocked out in the more basic roughing out stage before. And if you were to go back about 3 years on this channel, you'd see that the first stage of drawing I used to do, I also used to do with line work, and then I would lower the opacity of that and do another layer of rough details. And I eventually just realized that I really liked doing the color blocks as the sort of doing a silhouette of the character as the first stage, because then I wasn't dealing with 2 layers of line work. So when I got into the line work in the stage that we're in right now, I wasn't confusing myself by doing slightly more refined lines over rougher lines and then going into inking, doing that layer again. And doing a silhouette first, I think really helps give you a better understanding of what the most important parts of your drawing are going to look like in the final piece, in terms of just the really rough thumbnail. Now, another thing I was thinking about for this is I wasn't going into it in the exact same way I go into my Singing Monsters More Monstrous drawings, because in those, while I don't always change up the design much, I am redesigning those characters to fit into a fantasy monster series. So sometimes there are things that I feel very inclined to change, like when I did my version of the Hyehehe, instead of having bells on its head, I turned those into spikes, or sometimes if I just feel like it, I'll give a creature a tail or something. In this, I wasn't really changing anything because I wasn't making these guys more monstrous exactly, I was kind of just drawing them in my art style. So I'm making them more proportionally similar to how I like to draw characters, and maybe like adding a few more teeth here or there. But for the most part, I wanted to make sure to keep it as true to the originals as possible while still doing it in my style and giving it my kind of flair. And even though I wasn't redesigning these creatures much, I still did the same thing that I always do when drawing any monsters, which is referencing real-world animals. Whatever animal I think it's most similar to, I'm referencing. So for the Hyehehe, on my other monitor, I'll have up images of wolves and like snarling wolves or dogs or different kinds of hounds, hyenas, things like that. For the Cherubble, I'd have images up of slugs and snails so I can get an idea of what those look like in real life and what kind of textures they have on them. And for the Anglow, I was obviously referencing things like octopus and squids and some crabs as well. And that is my biggest tip for anyone that wants to get into designing monsters and creatures, is study real-world animal anatomy. I've talked a bunch of times on the channel before about how I personally took a course that you can find on both Skillshare or Udemy by a guy named Jeffrey Jacobs. I can link it in the description, but honestly, there's probably tons of different courses on there. I did that one over a decade ago. But it is super helpful to learn how to do real-world animal anatomy, because from there you can just do so many different combinations and changes to create any fantasy monster that, I mean, not exists, but that you can imagine. Now, like I said, this is usually where I'd move into the inking after the rough detailing is done, where I do my refined line work. But as I said, this drawing is a little bit different of a beast to tackle than some other things, because we've got parts of creatures in front of the logo, behind the logo, so I'm doing things in a slightly different order. What I'm doing right now is going in and inking and then just putting in the flat colors for anything that's in front of the logo. So the Hyehehe's head and one of its hands that's kind of reaching over the logo, and some of the rare Anglow's arms and its tongue, tentacle, the ball that sits on its tongue. And I'm doing those in their own layers and folders because I wanted to make sure that both I and the My Singing Monsters team had some freedom after the drawing was finished to move things around. So if we wanted to repose a character slightly, easily. We could just take that character's folder and inch them over to the left or right or whatever needed changing. It turned out we didn't end up needing to change anything, except one goofy little thing that was my bad, but I'll get to that later. But it was still better to have the freedom to be able to change things just in case. So again, I get through all the inking for the parts in front, and then I put in the flat colors, but I don't do the shading and lighting on those yet, because I wanted to do the full Anglows rendering at once and the full Hyehehes rendering at once. I probably could have just done the shading and lighting for those parts of the creatures now, but I decided to do the creatures one at a time. Again, this is not my usual process for doing things, but different projects sometimes require to change things up a little bit. So then after all of that, I went on to doing just the full Cherubble, because it was the one that was kind of the easiest to do. Not just because, you know, design-wise, it felt like it was a little bit easier. It didn't actually have any limbs, unless you count the harp thing sticking out of its back as a limb, but also mainly because all of its body was behind the logo. There was nothing in front of it, so I wasn't doing it in separate sections, except, of course, for when I realized that it, you know, it has those little floaty guys that I think are called charms that fly around it. Those I also did in their own separate layers, and I ended up being very glad that I did that, because I do end up moving one of them down a bit, because I realized I'd drawn it with like half of its body hidden in behind the big blue bubble logo. So later on I just tweak it, move it down a little bit, and then even in a different version of the drawing which doesn't have the logo, I ended up moving it again because I thought compositionally it looked better. But again, I gave myself the freedom, and I did end up getting to get some benefit out of that. My only little uncertainty with the rare Cherubble was what texture to do the leafy kind of stuff around its back. I mean, I was thinking that it was kind of like a shrubbery. A shrubbery! And so I decided to texture it in a similar way to how I would do trees or bushes in the backgrounds of any of my Fantasy Beast drawings. Which, when you kind of sit and stare at it, it doesn't look fantastic, but when it's part of a bigger piece, I think it looks really nice, and I think the Cherubble with that texture mixed with some of the sort of slimy textures that I add from referencing things like slugs and snails, and how they don't have scales, but they have, I don't know, a sort of texture to them that I add a little bit of that onto its body as well. And all of those things combined, all the different textures, I think make this end up looking really nice. Although one thing I do partway through the drawing is the parts of it that are in behind the logo and the Anglow, I end up adding a bit of a purple fade onto them to make them disappear a little bit more into the background. Because with just the full bright colors of it directly behind the Anglow and the logo, it feels like it's drawing a little bit too much attention, so I was kind of adding some exaggerated atmospheric perspective to it, knowing that the background was going to have a lot of purple to it, but obviously don't put any of that on the part that I want to be very prominent of that character showing, like its head or anything that's not being blocked by another creature. Now, after the rare Cherubble was finished, I moved on to the rare Hyehehe, and I was super excited about this one, even though, again, I have drawn a Hyehehe before. This being the rare version of it was a lot of fun, and I really like when I get to tackle any creature that has a bunch of fur to it. People who are avid subscribers and followers of this channel know that around 6 months ago or so, when I did one of my famous cartoon characters as werewolves videos, or famous dogs as werewolves videos, I finally figured out a fur rendering technique that I really liked. So now anytime I get to do a creature that has a lot of fur to it, it's pretty easy to make it end up looking pretty cool, because just doing that same texturing pattern works really nicely. And it's especially nice when a creature has a bunch of fur and then some kind of other texture to it, which this one has. I mean, it's mostly furry, but it's got other stuff as well. And I like the design element of the banana head. That was a fun change. And it helped even more that this creature is my favorite color combination. Purple and yellow. People have asked me a bunch of times if I have a favorite color. I guess I'd say purple, but mostly I have favorite color combinations. And my two favorites are purple and yellow together, I absolutely love, so obviously love the rare Hyehehe here. And then also pink and black, which black, technically not a color, but whatever. Pink and black is also another combination that I really like. But so for the Hyehehe here, it was fun to do the texturing on its fur and the sort of cotton fluff that's kind of coming out from its neck and part of its sides. Its stitching is kind of coming undone a little bit, which is a really cool element. And then in the roughing stage, I didn't mention this then, but I also thought I'd made its pose a little bit too boring, so then I decided to have one of its feet kind of kicking up a little bit, and it's looking down and seeing that it's sort of like it's stepping around one of the rare Anglow's tentacles, which is something you won't be able to see if you're on, I think, the iPad version, because its leg is kind of cropped out. But if you look at the art being used for promo or, on one of the wider screens, then you'll be able to see that full thing. And then for the rare Anglow, which was the one that my whole premise for the composition of this one was based around it being behind the piece and kind of reaching up and around. That's the one where I kind of goofed something up a little bit. Important note for anyone when you're doing any kind of commission work or work for a client. I don't do a lot of this. I almost never take commissions. I took this one because it was a very special occasion where I'm a big fan of My Singing Monsters. They're a big fan of my versions of their creatures. So I was like, okay, this is one that I'm definitely not going to turn down. But if you do end up doing any commission work or work for clients, I highly recommend that you always over-communicate. Even if you think you have a silly or stupid question, just ask it anyway, because you never want to spend a lot of time working on something just to realize it's not what the client wants, because either you're going to have to spend a lot of time redoing it, or you're going to end up delivering something that isn't what the client actually wanted, and you're probably going to lose that relationship and not be able to work with them again in the future. That didn't happen here, but what happened is I should have asked if they also needed a version without the logo, because I was purely designing this thing to have that logo in place. But it turned out they did want a version without the logo as well to use for, on the App Store. They're using this as promotion as well, which is super cool. But in that version, they didn't want the logo in it. But this really did not end up being a big deal at all, because, for one, because I'd done everything on so many different layers, it was super easy to go in and add something else in between and around the different layers and to pop the logo out, because I hadn't actually drawn anything attached to that logo. It was its own separate layer. So, of course, I didn't actually find this out until I'd done a finished version with the logo in there. So the last thing I did after I quote-unquote finished the Anglow, or at least, without anything in behind the logo, I went in and I added a super basic background inspired by the Mythical Island. And I knew that I didn't want to... for one thing, the main thing that I really like doing is drawing creatures and characters. I can do backgrounds, but I've basically gotten to a point where my backgrounds are good enough to look cool with my creatures and characters and to help emphasize them, but my specialty isn't backgrounds, and I had also made the creatures so completely filling the frame that I knew I had to go with just super basic version of the background. So I looked at the Mythical Island, took just the most simple elements of it, had it just be a round platform beneath them, and really most of what we're seeing is the starry sky in behind them, which is something I already really like the look of. And because the rare Hyehehe is purple and the background for the Mythical Island is kind of a bit of a teal to purpley black kind of fade, I literally just color picked that from the image that I was referencing, but then I darken it down way more to make sure the purple of the background still has enough contrast with the purple of the Hyehehe. And then once I just whipped in some last little details, making a few changes here and there, I got to a finished version of the piece with the logo in there that I was super happy with. And given that the My Singing Monsters team is a fan of my My Singing Monsters More Monstrous series, I was feeling pretty confident that they were going to like it as well. So I sent it over to them, and they were stoked about it. They said it was looking awesome. They were really happy about it. But also that is when they mentioned the thing about needing a version without the logo in behind. No big deal, I said, so I jumped in and started doing the rest of the Anglow that had been rendered out behind the logo, and also changed the Hyehehe's hand that had been, or its claw that had been on the logo. Because obviously having its hand just up on nothing wouldn't really make any sense, but that arm was not super detailed and rendered anyway because it had mostly been behind the logo, so I just kind of chopped that part off of it and had its arm kind of up a little bit more to help emphasize that it's kind of trying to balance itself while standing over one of the rare Anglow's tentacles. With rendering out the rest of the rare Anglow's body, it was really easy because compositionally I had essentially already planned what it would look like, because I had one of its mouths going a little bit over the logo and one of its mouths going a little bit below the logo. So filling all that in was really just a matter of just blocking in the rest of the character and making sure to color and texture it in the same way as its bottom and top half so that it all blended together and didn't look like two separate chunks of creature. It all looked like one thing. That was that, and the art was done. We can take a look at it here, and I don't know which, I think I might like the version without the logo better. I'm not totally sure. I really like both versions. Again, I originally planned it to be with the logo, but I also like just seeing the full rendering and the texturing on these creatures, just them standing there on their own, just my artwork. I think that's super cool looking, but either way, I'm super happy with both pieces turned out. The My Singing Monsters team asked for no changes after that, and now you can officially see this art in the game and up on the App Store, being used on their socials as promotional art, and even in the game they've given me an official shout out as a creator, and they've linked to a bunch of my Singing Monsters videos, which even at the time that I'm recording this has already given me a big uptick in views on my channel. So overall, this was just a super fun process. I'm so glad this video is finally out, and that for the next month, you're all gonna get to see my art in the actual My Singing Monsters game.
I am just so happy about how this piece turned out, and obviously it's that much better that the My Singing Monsters team was really happy about it too. Huge thank you to Jen, Tyson, and David, and everyone over at the My Singing Monsters team for hiring me to do this project. And huge thank you to the My Singing Monsters community for embracing the My Singing Monsters art that I've made so much. If it wasn't for all of you watching and getting the video passed around more, the My Singing Monsters team might not have even seen it, and this wouldn't have happened. If you haven't seen my My Singing Monsters More Monstrous episodes, or maybe even my newest My Singing Monsters Superheroes episode, I'll link a playlist with all of my best My Singing Monsters stuff in it, including a compilation of my first 6 My Singing Monsters More Monstrous episodes. And as I said, I do have a new original series starting up set in that universe, which was actually voted on by my subscribers, called The Summoner's Beasts. Because Tayrin is a beast summoner, he's going to be going around and finding the perfect team of beasts to summon for a big threat that's coming to his universe. And as I've done every month for over 5 years now, I'm doing a community redraw event for the month of June, in which I'll be adapting some subscriber-submitted art into this very storyline. So for anyone listening and interested in participating, what I want you to do is to create your own kind of cute monster creature. Something like you would see in My Singing Monsters or in Pokemon or something like that. You can even tell me in the description if you want it to be a monster of song. But don't make your design too creepy or monstrous, because as I do in my My Singing Monsters More Monstrous series, I'm going to take the creatures that some of you submit and make them into more monstrous fantasy beasts. Instructions will be up on screen, and the email that you can submit to will be linked in the description. Make sure to submit before the deadline, and please do not submit any AI-generated art. No matter your skill level, I want to see what you can make, not what an AI program can make. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and the thought I want to leave people with today is a quote by Carol Dweck, who says that when you have a growth mindset, challenges are seen as exciting and not threatening. So instead of thinking, oh, if I try to face this challenge, I'm going to expose my weaknesses, you instead think, wow, this is a fantastic opportunity for growth. Looking at any challenge that way can really help you go into it with a lot more gusto and oomph. I hope that's inspiring. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday, which is this month's PopCross Community Redraw, redrawing some subscribers' Bayou Nights. And it's a pretty great story too. I'm excited for you all to hear it.